The Edmund Fitzgerald moved eastward through the cold November air, settling into the familiar rhythm of a full-load run. Behind the long steel hull, the waters of Lake Superior folded into a narrow wake. Ahead lay a route that the ship had travelled many times. But this run would unfold under conditions that shifted hour by hour, shaped by a developing storm system sweeping toward the Great Lakes. On November 9th, 1975, the ship completed loading at the Burlington Northern Dock in Superior, Wisconsin. The cargo consisted of more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets bound for a steel mill on the lower lakes. The loading process left the ship riding low in the water, nearly to its design limit. This was common during late-season runs, when every trip counted before winter closed the lakes. The Fitzgerald departed in the early afternoon. Snow flurries drifted across the harbour. Winds were already rising. Behind the Fitzgerald, the Arthur M. Anderson began loading for its own run. The two ships had often travelled similar routes, and both crews were accustomed to tracking each other's progress. The Anderson would leave later in the day, maintaining radio contact for much of the voyage. As the Fitzgerald cleared the harbour and entered open water, Captain Ernest McSorley received weather advisories indicating the possibility of worsening conditions. A low-pressure system was intensifying as it moved northeast out of the Central Plains. Meteorologists were tracking its pressure drop and rapid strengthening, noting that it had the potential to produce severe winds across the northern lakes. For mariners on Lake Superior, such advisories required attention, but not alarm. November storms were a known hazard. Crews trained year after year to operate safely under difficult conditions. Many considered these storms part of the season's rhythm. The key was vigilance and preparation. Captain McSorley chose a northern route along the Canadian shoreline. This course offered some shelter from the full force of west and northwest winds. It was a logical choice given the system's projected track. The ship's long hull and powerful engines were well equipped for heavy seas, yet every advantage mattered when facing weather of this scale. The Fitzgerald's early progress was steady. Winds increased through the afternoon, bending trees along the shoreline and building small but persistent waves across the lake. The ship maintained its speed. Below deck, engineers monitored the boilers and propulsion systems. On the bridge, officers tracked the pressure drop and updated course headings. As the Anderson departed later that day, its crew observed the worsening conditions. The wind shifted toward the northeast before swinging west again. Snow bands moved over the lake, alternating between brief clearings and periods of reduced visibility. The two ships remained in communication, comparing navigational data and monitoring the storm's development. By nightfall, the system had intensified into a full gale. Weather forecasts upgraded advisories into warnings. Lake Superior is known for steep, closely spaced waves during storms, and by late evening, the seas began to reflect that pattern. Reports from vessels across the lake indicated wave heights already exceeding 10 feet, with higher crests developing. The Fitzgerald pressed on. The ship's long deck, stretching nearly the length of 2 football fields, rose and fell with the movements of the water. The hull flexed slightly under the strain, a normal behavior in rough seas, but the conditions were expected to grow far more severe. Through the night, the pressure in the storm system continued to fall. Its center moved north of Wisconsin and into Ontario, pulling strong winds behind it. These winds swept across the full fetch of Lake Superior, creating the kind of wave patterns that mariners recognized as dangerous. Forecasts called for winds reaching storm force, and in some areas potentially hurricane force. At 1 a.m. on November 10th, the National Weather Service issued storm warnings for the region. By this point, the Fitzgerald was well out into open water. The crew maintained steady communication with the Anderson and with coastal radio stations. But conditions were now deteriorating rapidly. Snow squalls reduced visibility. Wind gusts grew stronger. Waves increased in size and irregularity. The Fitzgerald continued along the northern route, staying near the Canadian shore. At times, the range lights on nearby headlands would have appeared and disappeared through snowfall and darkness. The cold air thickened. Spray began freezing on exposed surfaces. For the crew, winter conditions arrived quickly. By early morning, the storm reached full strength. Winds shifted to the northwest, pushing water along the length of the lake and creating sustained waves over 20 feet tall. Some crests reported by vessels reached even higher. Long period rollers mixed with shorter, sharper waves, producing chaotic and unpredictable motion. As daylight began to break on November 10th, the Fitzgerald and the Anderson remained in intermittent radio contact. Conditions made communication challenging. Static interference increased. Snow reduced visibility to near zero at times. Yet both crews continued to track the situation carefully. Captain McSorley, known for his calm and practical approach to lake storms, maintained the ship's course toward Whitefish Bay. This bay, protected by land and sheltered from the direct force of the waves, represented safety. Once inside, the vessel would find calmer water and a path toward the Sulocks. Throughout the morning, the Fitzgerald encountered increasingly difficult conditions. Crew members reported heavy seas washing over the deck. Instruments indicated significant wave heights and strong gusts. The ship's behavior changed as the storm intensified, responding to the uneven swells that lifted and dropped the hull. Around mid-morning, the Fitzgerald sustained an important mechanical issue. The captain reported a loss of radar capability. In a storm of this magnitude, radar was vital for identifying land features, other vessels, and navigational aids. Without it, the Fitzgerald had to rely on dead reckoning and the reports coming from the Anderson, which still had its radar functioning. McSorley contacted the Anderson and requested assistance in providing position updates. The two ships formed an informal navigational partnership, with the Anderson trailing behind and supplying bearings and distances. This arrangement was not uncommon in severe conditions, but it increased the complexity of the voyage. Shortly after the radar failure, the Fitzgerald reported that it had taken on some topside damage. McSorley noted the loss of vent covers and described the ship as having a bad list. A list indicates that the vessel is leaning to one side. This can result from uneven cargo weight, water intrusion, or shifting stability. The specifics were unclear at the time, but the information suggested that the ship was no longer handling the seas with its usual stability. Wave heights continued to climb. The lake's surface turned chaotic. Ship logs from the Anderson and other vessels recorded extreme conditions. Some waves crashed over pilot houses. Others swept decks, carrying ice and spray that froze upon contact. Crews described the experience as one of constant impact, a steady assault from the lake. Despite the mounting difficulties, the Fitzgerald remained underway, pushing toward Whitefish Bay. It passed near Caribou Island, an area known for shallow shoals. The lack of radar made this portion of the route particularly hazardous. But the Fitzgerald cleared the region safely, guided by headings and bearings from the Anderson. By early afternoon, the situation grew more complicated. The Whitefish Point light and its associated radio beacon, both critical navigational aids, were offline due to a power failure. For ships in the storm, this loss removed important points of reference. The Fitzgerald now faced worsening conditions with diminished visibility, no radar, and no shore-based signals to guide its approach towards safe water. Even so, the ship continued to make progress. The Anderson, trailing behind, monitored its own navigation and reported updates as needed. Radio communications between the two ships remained steady. In these exchanges, McSorley maintained his characteristic composure. Reports were factual and brief. He noted issues as they arose, but kept the ship moving forward. Around 3:30 p.m., the Fitzgerald reported that it was experiencing difficulties maintaining heading. This can occur when waves strike the ship at angles that force it off course. It can also indicate reduced maneuverability or stability. The Anderson continued to track the Fitzgerald's movements, adjusting its own course accordingly. As conditions worsened, further, mariners across the lake described the storm as one of the most severe in years. The National Weather Service later confirmed that gusts reached hurricane force in some areas. Wave heights likely exceeded 25 feet. The combination of wind speed, wave patterns, and rapidly dropping temperatures created a scenario that pushed even well-built ships to their limits. Late in the afternoon, McSorley contacted the Anderson with a message that has since become one of the defining statements of the event. He reported that the ship was holding its own. The phrase reflected his steady demeanor, offering neither alarm nor optimism. It was a practical assessment in the face of extreme weather. But shortly after, the Anderson observed that the Fitzgerald had slowed. The ship appeared lower in the water. Its lights were visible, but visibility conditions meant the Anderson often lost sight of the Fitzgerald entirely between waves and snowfall. The storm's intensity made visual tracking difficult at best. By 4:30 p.m., the Anderson's captain, Jess Cooper, and first mate, Bernie Cooper, continued to log wave heights and wind speeds. They maintained steady communication with McSorley. The Fitzgerald pressed on toward the relative shelter of Whitefish Bay, but its exact situation remained uncertain. As the afternoon turned toward evening, darkness approached quickly. Snow clouds thickened. Visibility fell once more. The lake grew colder. The Fitzgerald made one of its final routine reports around 7:10 p.m. McSorley stated that they were nearing Whitefish Bay. There was no sign in his voice of panic or distress, though the conditions remained hazardous. The Anderson prepared to follow the Fitzgerald into the bay once visibility improved enough to safely identify navigational markers. Radio operators listened closely for updates from any vessel in the region. The storm continued to exert its full force on the lake. Waves reached extreme heights, and the wind howled across the surface. At 7:15 p.m., the Anderson attempted another call to the Fitzgerald to provide an updated bearing. There was no response. A second call was made, then a third. Each returned in silence. At first, The Anderson's crew assumed the Fitzgerald was adjusting course or experiencing temporary radio interference. But as minutes passed without reply, concern grew. The Anderson's radar, still functioning, no longer showed the Fitzgerald's return signal. The screen displayed only the storm's heavy interference patterns and the faint outlines of other vessels. The absence of the Fitzgerald's echo became the first clear sign that something had gone wrong. At 7:25 p.m., Captain Cooper contacted the Coast Guard to report that the Fitzgerald was missing. The ship had vanished from radar. No debris, no distress call, no final message indicating imminent danger. The Fitzgerald had been only minutes away from the relative safety of Whitefish Bay. For most of the afternoon, the ship had continued forward despite damage, heavy seas, and navigational challenges. But now, in the growing darkness, it was gone. The storm raged through the night. Winds gradually weakened after midnight, and waves began to settle. But the quiet that followed carried a heavy weight. The largest ship on the Great Lakes had disappeared, without a clear indication of why or how. The Fitzgerald had faced storms before, many of them severe. It had a long record of reliable performance, and its captain was among the most experienced on the lakes. Yet on this night, the ship did not reach the safety of Whitefish Bay. Somewhere in the cold, deep waters of Lake Superior, the vessel rested out of sight, beginning a series of questions that would echo across the region for decades. The disappearance marked the turning point in the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The next phase would involve the urgent search for the ship, the difficult work of rescue and recovery, and the long effort to understand what had happened in those final moments. The mystery was only beginning.